like to welcome you all to the Hexham Mini-Conf. We've been running the Mini-Conf since 2007, where it was the Aussie Chicks Mini-Conf, and it's been going for 5 years. The number of women in the conference has increased dramatically in that time, which has been really good because it used to be about 2 or 3 people compared to all the guys. So our numbers have increased. We have a lot more women speaking in the main conference as well as speaking in this group as well. This mini-conf isn't just for women to come and listen to. If you've heard that, that's not correct. The guys can come too. There's plenty of guys here now, and we have some interesting talks for you today. I'm Robin, and this is Bianca, and she'll be introducing the talks this morning.
Can you stay on that page so I can read the description? The first talk will be Skye Cruiser talking about feminism, anarchism and FOSS. The description is: the language of open source software is increasingly being applied to politics as people talk about and develop open government projects. However, much of this discussion does not unpack the politics of openness, instead taking for granted that it involves a technologically enhanced model of existing liberal democratic ideals. However, there are other ways to interpret what free and open source politics might look like. One is to more thoroughly apply the politics espoused by key figures within the free and open source software movements, such as Stallman and Raymond. However, a more radical route is to take the commitment to decentralisation of power that lies at the heart of free and open source software and apply it not only to an analysis of politics, but also to the existing free and open source software movement. This route demonstrates that there are useful lessons to be learned from looking at the interaction between free software principles, anarchism and feminism.
Okay, it's changed a little bit from that, but still basically the same. So to start off, I am a lecturer and researcher. I don't code, so if I make technical errors, feel free to tell me later. And this is a very, very brief talk of a conversation that could be much, much longer, so feel free to catch me later if you're interested. So to start off with, I'm going to be giving a brief sketch of what open source politics is and how it's being used. It's kind of a caricature of a broad and very nuanced field, just so I can pull out some key points. You can look at them in more detail, and there are some more nuanced politics out there, but yeah, I'm going to go with the caricature version for this time. I'm going to go through some critiques of those, which unsurprisingly, given the title of the talk, will draw heavily on anarchism and feminism, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those are as I go along. And then I'm going to talk a bit about what a reimagined open source politics might look like if it was cross-fertilized with anarchism and feminism. My slides are very dull. Don't try to read all of those quotations if you don't want to. They're just to give you something else to look at, and because I feel like I need to cite my sources. So there are a few main characteristics when people start talking about open source politics or open government, these kind of things. Firstly, the idea of increased transparency. So that's usually thought of as being able to get government data and documents more easily and other important information. This is also linked to the idea of increased accountability, although there's not really much of a sense of how that is going to be enforced. Increased participation, so often the idea of like more technologically mediated participation. People will be able to talk in electronic town halls, people will be able to give in their important concerns online, like the petition to whitehouse.gov, that kind of thing, and also often drawing on these ideas of crowdsourcing, like if we can get more people to participate in discussing political issues, we'll get better policy. And also some talk of shifts in organisational forms, so kind of flattening out hierarchies quite often. Yeah. However, there's a few assumptions that go along with this that we don't always examine in detail and that we don't really draw out. The first of those is that we need to make the system better. So what we have in terms of liberal democracy is essentially okay as a framework, but what we need to do is kind of work on the fine details. We need more transparency, more participation, more democracy, but always working within the same framework. The second one is the assumption that what we need is more information and also more dialogue. So a lot of the rhetoric around WikiLeaks, and the reason why we need WikiLeaks is because we need to get that information out there and people need to know these things, and once they do, things will change for the better. Also the idea of more dialogue. If we can just all talk to each other, then we'll all understand each other better and we will be able to solve all of our problems. I think that this is a particularly useful quotation there. We're talking about the lure of fundamentalism and the clash of conflicting value systems. And as interactive technologies develop, then we'll be able to launch the kind of conversations that change our relationships and help us relate to each other better. Okay, and finally, this assumption that, thirdly, the assumption that innovation and entrepreneurship will solve all of our problems, often related to technology. So this is a really big stream running through the TED Talks. Like, well, we've got this exciting new technology that is innovative and run by a small company, and that is going to fix everything. And it's often applied to government more broadly as well. We need to make government more innovative. We need to make government look more like business, particularly small, streamlined businesses like kind of small scale setups, particularly. All right. And then the final assumption is that this idea, the models we're seeing from FOSS of collaborative, decentralized organizational forms are new. So Don Rushkoff, for example, talks about how once you've been involved in open source, you will magically be able to see that the world can be changed, that things aren't set, that it's not hardware, it's software, and you can modify things if you want to. Once you've had this experience of controlling your own operating system or doing open source programming. Okay, so as promised, I have some critiques of these ideas. They sound great, right? Super shiny. The first critique is that from a feminist, specifically a feminist anarchist point of view, the argument is that the system we have is fundamentally flawed. So rather than saying, well, government is here to serve you and all we need to do is make government more efficient and more transparent, anarchists would argue that the state is fundamentally oppressive. The state is always a form of hierarchy that relies on force. So the state ultimately has control because it controls the army, because it controls the police force. Essentially, the reasons why people support the state are because if you don't, there will be consequences, rather than necessarily because you think that it is for the best. Although there's also an aspect of ideological hegemony, which means that the state also has power because it has managed to convince everyone that this model of politics is either the best or the best possible version. And to add to that anarchist critique, you can also think about a feminist critique and other critiques which look at the way in which state power is disproportionately targeted at women, particularly at women's bodies, at regulating women's bodies, and also at other marginalised groups. So if we look at the disproportional criminalisation of and incarceration of African Americans and Aboriginal Australians. And these critiques say that these are not just kind of temporary problems that aren't inherent to the state, but they're rather at the basis of how the state functions. The state always functions with exploitation and the repression of some groups for the benefit of others, which is also tied to a Marxist analysis which sees the state as heavily tied to class. So it's not an accident that the state tends to, and you can see this in a far more marked way in the US, that the state tends to pass laws that benefit those who are most well off rather than those who are least well off. The second critique is the idea that focusing on information and dialogue hides power inequalities. So having more information doesn't necessarily mean you can change the world. When WikiLeaks had those massive data dumps around Iraq and Afghanistan, or the collateral murder video, things like that, firstly, most people already knew, or anyone who had spent any time looking already should have known that what the US was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan involved a whole heap of human rights violations. Having that information available didn't necessarily change anything, because having information is nothing alone. We saw some of the largest anti-war rallies and marches in Australia when the Iraq War was declared. It didn't change government policy. So information alone is not enough. Dialogue alone is also not enough, because power inequalities still exist. People don't necessarily disagree simply because they don't understand rationally what the other person's argument is. And in particular, those in power are unwilling to give up the power that they have. So the feminist critique looks at privilege in the context of gender relations, the way in which many men are unaware of power inequalities, and the way in which gender relations structure power and privilege. Even once they become aware of it, many men are still not willing to give that up because it disadvantages them. You can also look at that at the level of the state or other groups. Going up to the US and saying, look, we've made a really rational argument for why you should no longer use drone warfare in other countries and kill children there, is not necessarily going to make them go, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, we'll stop now. Because people have invested in the power they have. It's in their interest to continue doing this. The third critique is that this neoliberal discourse of how we just need to outsource everything to the market is really problematic, because the market is not always your friend. In some cases it is, but in many cases it's not. And that's because the market can only provide services and is only interested in providing services which they can make a profit from. And feminist critiques have really highlighted this in many cases, as saying, like, well, it's not profitable to provide rape crisis centres, it's not profitable to provide homeless shelters, it's not profitable necessarily to provide childcare for women, or for families more generally. And as more services get outsourced to other companies, we also see problems where they try to turn these services into a profit-making model. So Serco, for example, is a multinational company that runs many prisons, hospitals, runs the detention centres here. They have an incentive to hire cheap labour who aren't properly staffed to deal with the traumatic conditions they're often working in, and therefore we see significant abuses of power. The company doesn't really have an incentive to do anything about that unless it's built into the initial contracts, which it's frequently not. Okay, and then finally, anarchists and feminists, and particularly anarchist feminists, have been looking at these models for a really long time, and that doesn't really matter in terms of, well, we were there first, come on. But it matters in terms of the experience that's already available out there and the models that are already available out there that people can experiment with, processes that are available for cross-fertilisation and so on. This is a really blurry photo from the Spanish Revolution, where people the anarchists played a key role in holding off the fascists for a while, and while they were doing it also set up childcare centres and free universities and all of that kind of stuff. So what might the alternative to this be? What might the alternative is saying open source politics is just like liberal democratic politics, but a little bit better? Firstly, I think it's really important, and anarchists really push the idea that there isn't an end point. We can't, and this is particularly important when we talk about, the ends determine the means. This is why we see, millions of people dying in places like China and Russia under communist governments, because there was this idea, well, we're aiming for this blueprint of a perfect society, so it makes sense to be prepared to sacrifice a few people along the way, a few million people along the way, whatever. Anarchists, on the other hand, say, well, the processes will determine the outcomes you get. So we don't necessarily have a blueprint for the perfect society. Instead, what we say is, well, okay, if you want a society that is more equal, less hierarchical, more environmentally sustainable, and so on and so forth, then you need to have processes that work in that way. You can't have hierarchical meetings where you have the leader telling everyone what to do while the women get told to go make the tea if you want to have a nice society at the end of it. And that should be prioritised over other considerations like efficiency, which can sometimes lead to really long, boring, consensus-based decision-making procedures, but they always need tweaking. And that is the other part as well, is that these processes must continually be in development, and what works in one context will not necessarily work in others. And I think that that's something that obviously FOSS communities have a lot of experience with themselves, of continually tweaking models, continually reworking processes. I think it's also important to have a pragmatic utopianism. So one of the slogans of the global justice movement is a better world is possible. So you have to believe that there is something else other than this, and there is a lot of evidence behind that. If somebody wants to bail me up later on and say, anarchism is all very well in theory, but it would never work in practice, try to form a group to do that, so I can just do it once. I've done it so many times now. But at the same time, we have to recognise that trying to work towards a stateless, non-hierarchical system in which everyone is equal doesn't really happen overnight. So while you're putting in place processes like that, building communities, building organisation, building community-based support services, we recognise that at the moment the state plays a fundamental mediating role in helping people. So particularly in the face of the globalisation of capital. So while we don't have those changes yet, we still need to think about things like the welfare state, support for single parents, support for the unemployed, all those kinds of things. They still need to exist, and we need to support them. And that is also something that the FOSS community can think about, is that theoretically, while FOSS would like to exist in a completely open and decentralised way, there are various groups who are excluded from the process because of structural inequalities. So what can be done to help to deal with that problem in the meantime? And this is related to a nuanced critique of hierarchy, which includes invisible hierarchies. So one of the things that you hear often in the FOSS community is that everything is a meritocracy. It's simply the people who are best who manage to get the furthest ahead. Well, that becomes a little bit confusing when you say, well, why are there so few people who aren't white, or so few people who aren't men who are involved? Is it simply because white men are inherently the best at this stuff, or is something else happening? There's also other invisible hierarchies. So if you, there's an important feminist work called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, where even if you in which you don't have a leader, in which you don't have a treasurer and so on, hierarchies will still emerge because one person is a little more confident speaking, because somebody else is more confident doing other things. This is why the organisational forms need to be continually revised and openly talked about. We need to think about also those invisible hierarchies that emerge and what we can do about them. And whether, the extent to which you accept them also based on merit and existing experience. And finally, I think that what feminism has brought to anarchism, which anarchism has been kind of crap at the past, in the past, is this idea that you can't just look at one axis at a time. So if you are really fiercely pro-open politics, you also need to think about how that intersects with other people's politics and with other people's struggles. You need to think about things like race and class and gender and so on, and how that might intersect with our ideas about open politics. When we're talking about more transparency, when we're talking about more accessibility, how does that affect marginalised groups? What does it mean to be more transparent in the context of some people who have identities that are threatened if they're made known, for example? What does it mean to be more accountable in a society where women often get more criticism piled onto them, and particularly very gendered criticism? So that brings me to the end. And if there are any questions, go ahead.
And can Denise come up and start setting up during questions?
Any questions? Any questions?
Sorry, just one question. Critique number 3, I think you stated the market is not your friend. The market only provides services which can make a profit. So
trying to fiddle the market in order to provide those services, which is what the government is often doing in terms of trying to outsource welfare services to NGOs or even to for-profit businesses. Instead, you think about ways to those. We as a community, for example, can say that we should look after childcare, we should look after people who are not doing well, we should look after people. We should create societies in which people do not have to be disabled by their environment, rather than trying to push it out to the market and then seeing how to fiddle with it to make it work.
But isn't that just shifting the problem rather than solving it?
Pardon?
Isn't that just shifting the problem rather than solving it?
Well, it's not necessarily thinking of it as a problem. So if you say we're shifting this problem to the market and then the market needs to solve it, but saying things like we should all look after each other within our communities and we should all, like, childcare is a communal responsibility whether or not you yourself end up having a child, for example, that doesn't necessarily need to be seen as a problem. It can be seen as a good thing that enriches our communities and helps us all. Was there a line? Is someone keeping track of that?
I've got the mic.
Right.
Does that make me the winner?
Yeah, you win.
Cool. I was just going to ask if you've got any examples of FOSS projects that are actually doing this really well in a feminist anarchist kind of way.
You know, I actually don't have enough experience with different FOSS projects to say that effectively. I mean, obviously, I really like everything that the ADA Initiative is doing. I really like the setup of this conference, having a code of conduct, providing childcare, those kinds of things. But I'm open. If you guys have ideas and case studies and examples, please come see me or tell me on the internet. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, I had forgotten. I should have cited Dreamwidth. Yeah, they're awesome.
Oh, hi. Look, I want to follow on from the first speaker. I'd like to suggest that you have a look towards public investment and positive externalities, which actually combine the community focus that you're looking for with market-like solutions in terms of resource efficiency, and it'd be possibly something to look at in terms of actually providing, both methods.
I think there are important critiques of that position, including the assumption that the market will always be more efficient, which I think would take a little bit more detail to go into. We assume that the market will always be efficient. That has evidently not always been the case.
Yeah, I want to follow on from the first person that put up their hand. So I support the position that not constantly looking to structures within the market to create the answers. There's some simple examples where I live. So I live in Queensland in New Farm, and there's quite a disparity between a number of sort of markets happening. One example is food, and so I travelled 2 blocks down to go and get my food at Coles. Why? Not because I agree with Coles or anything like that, but because I'm tired and I'm lazy. And I would prefer to support the small growers and the people that actually, rather than creating monopoly with Coles, etc. So I've signed up to Food Connect to do that, and that is creating little. The small growers put food into boxes and you collect them from people's properties. There's another example with homelessness in New Farm as well. So you've got people with a large cash flow, but you walk past the corner and there's a number of homeless people, a number of people that are on very low income, and you know there's social problems, etc., but nobody actually stops to talk to them or reach out to them. So these are kind of simple things that people can do to actually make a difference, like, yeah.
And I think part of the problem with assuming that the state should take care of those things is that it's not our problem. It's not our problem if there are homeless people in our community or other things like that. How are we going for time? Is there time for more questions, or am I done?
You're done.
Okay.